I like flags. We're in Philadelphia. That's the Betsy Ross House. On this episode of Retracing History, you can figure out what we're talking about. All right, let's just start this episode with a massive bombshell. Betsy Ross did not make the first American flag. At least, there's very little evidence to indicate that she did it. What we have to go off of is a lecture that was presented by her grandson, William Canby, in 1870, claiming this story to have been passed down for a few generations, that in one particular spring day in 1776, Betsy Ross was met in her house by a flag committee from the Continental Congress, including George Washington, and requested her to create a prototype of what could become the national colors. I am going to later on read the segment of Canby's lecture and I'll let you decide, but I just want to start off right with that's the primary source about the whole Betsy Ross mythology. Since then, there's been several affidavits that have been produced by descendants, and that's really the bread and butter of it. That being said, it doesn't mean we should discredit Betsy Ross, that we should say that she was just completely made up, there's nothing to speak of her. That is far from the case. Betsy Ross was a real person. She existed. She lived through the American Revolution in one of the most important cities to the Revolution, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The tricky thing is, though, when you want to make a video about Betsy Ross's life, there's not a lot to go off of. We know she existed. She appears in passing in various records. But just about everybody in orbit around Betsy Ross has more evidence surviving about their livelihood than Betsy herself. It also doesn't help that when you talk about Betsy Ross, that's really not her full name. She was born Elizabeth Griscom, and she went under 3 different surnames. The Ross one actually only being for a few years. The longest surname she was attached to, Claypool, most people don't know her as. So a lot of stuff to get into about Betsy Ross. I am by no means an expert on her biography, so I went out and sought some various resources to do some research to put into my brain, and hopefully I'll remember some information. The main resource I am using is Marla Miller's Betsy Ross and the Making of America, and I also going to be using the signage that is used to interpret Betsy Ross's life at the Betsy Ross House Museum. And there's a few other articles. All these references, they'll be listed at the end of this video. So where do we begin with the story of Elizabeth Griscom? Well, best way to begin is when she was born, January 1st, 1752, to Samuel and Rebecca Griscom. The Griscom family were of Quaker belief. They lived initially on a farm in New Jersey, on the New Jersey side of the Delaware, I should say. So they're looking at Philadelphia, but nope, Elizabeth is actually a New Jersey girl. The family ended up having 17 different children. Not all of them survived to adulthood, mindhood, but it gives you an idea of the massive household that Betsy was raised in. Samuel was a carpenter, and he really wanted to get involved in building structures in Philadelphia itself. It was a much more lucrative trade, and by the mid-1760s he had earned enough to move the family into downtown Philadelphia and basically built the family house by hand, located along Arch Street. And Arch Street will be very important to Betsy's life. Betsy was very fortunate to have a higher education compared to most women of her age. Of course, she would go to a Quaker school. Then once she was done with that, she actually became an apprentice for John Webster, a noted upholsterer who actually came over from London and had an upholstery shop in downtown Philadelphia for a number of years before the American Revolution. And it was at this Webster upholstery shop where she learned the trade that she would have for the rest of her life. Everybody says she's a seamstress. I mean, yeah, technically she did do sewing, but that wasn't her profession. She was an upholsterer. And the upholstery business at this point did more than just simply stuff mattresses and stuff chair cushions. They were involved in making bed dresses. You have to remember back then we're dealing with like the multi-post beds, so making dresses, drapes for all of those beds. They're involved with working on curtains. They're selling wallpaper. So they basically make all of your hard wooden furniture comfortable. That was the upholsterer's job. And there were many upholsterers in Philadelphia as we go toward the American Revolution. And another upholsterer was John Ross, who, hey look, he was working for John Webster at the same time as Elizabeth Griscom was. And yes, that is Betsy Ross's first husband. That's where the name Ross comes from. They would marry in late 1773. And it was not a marriage that the Griscoms approved. The problem was John Ross, he was the son of an Anglican clergyman. And it's kind of ironic. When I was doing a little reading, Samuel and Rebecca Griscom actually got censored by their meeting house due to their relationship. They would later have to apologize as such. However, the first of several of the Griscoms' daughters all ended up marrying out of the meeting house or doing something that was unbecoming of a Quaker. So they would end up getting censored. Some apologized, others did not. I want to say Betsy was the fourth one to get censored. And she initially had no regrets about marrying out of the meeting house. Her and John, they actually got married at a tavern on the New Jersey side of the Delaware River. And then they went right into business. They opened up their own upholstery shop, the Ross Upholstery business, opened up shop, and they opened up at a perfect time because at this point, Revolution fever is in the air. In 1774, the First Continental Congress is going to meet in Philadelphia, debating what they're going to do about all the taxes and the intolerable acts being imposed, particularly upon the New England colonies by the British Empire, but the southern colonies had their own problems as well. So that means you're going to have a lot of lucrative people in town wanting to buy things from these artisans, especially from the upholstery shop. And we know from surviving records that Ross's upholstery shop was frequented by John Cadwalader, by Benjamin Chew, and yes, by George Washington, who commissioned some bed dressings be made by Mr. and Mrs. Ross for Mount Vernon. Something else is just curious about Elizabeth Griscom's tie to the Revolutionary War. Her father, as I mentioned, was a carpenter. He was part of the Carpenters Guild of Philadelphia. Do you know where the Carpenters Guild met to do business? Carpenters Hall. And wouldn't you know that that was the same venue for the First Continental Congress? So yeah, I wonder how Samuel Griscom felt with a bunch of political radicals pretty much interrupting his trade so they can use his place of employment to have this revolutionary meeting happen. But eventually, talk of a revolution led to fighting a revolution. The American Revolution begins formally in April of 1775. You're going to have the Second Continental Congress meet, not in Carpenter's Hall. They'll meet elsewhere, the venue that becomes Independence Hall. I hope that made Samuel Griscom a little more happier, a little more at ease. I don't know, maybe being at war probably didn't make him at ease. In any case, if you're wondering, where was Betsy and John's political allegiance? You don't have to look much further than some of the items they owned. They owned a map of the rebellion in New England that was bought right as it was being printed in the summer of 1775 and likely hung in their upholstery shop. And John would volunteer for service with the Patriot Militia in the city of Philadelphia. So they were both very much already in support of independence of the United States of America. That being said, John Ross, we don't know what exactly happened, be it he was killed outright or severely injured. It's said by the family that there was a sabotage event, an explosion happened of a powder magazine in Philadelphia, which ultimately led to John Ross's death in early 1776, leading Betsy to be a widow at just 24 years of age. Following the death of her husband, Betsy would end up relocating the upholstery business and her residence to a couple rooms, renting them from a widow by the name of Mrs. Lithgow. And this structure is what's now recognized as the Betsy Ross House. But it's important to understand, Betsy never owned any property in her entire life. She and her various husbands and families, they rented numerous storefronts and lived in the same structure all across the city of Philadelphia. So 249 Arch Street is just one of several addresses that she knew. It's also worth noting that the best evidence that places Betsy at this location are affidavits from her descendants, a lot of them that were sworn in the late 19th and early 20th century. Maybe there are some other archival evidence I don't know about. What I discovered reading Miller's book is that there are scant tax records that survive of Betsy in Philadelphia during the Revolution. Again, we know she lived in Philadelphia during the Revolution, but tax records, for one reason or another, just haven't survived. I'm not saying it's conspiracy, it's just you find this more common than not when you're doing genealogical research. Now, the streets of Philly have changed considerably since the days of Betsy Ross. If you want a better sense of what it would have been like to be an artisan running a business during the Revolution, I recommend checking out Elfrith's Alley. Since 1703, this has been a continuously inhabited neighborhood, with several structures dating to the period of the 1770s. And thus, that brings us to what everybody knows Betsy Ross for. Supposedly, in the spring of 1776, a committee sent by the Continental Congress approached Betsy Ross with making a prototype of the first national flag of the United States of America. And let's look at what is considered the main source for claiming Betsy made this flag. That is her grandson's lecture by William Canby, which he gave in front of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in 1870. And actually, I'm going to let you hear this whole excerpt, his own words, what was passed down through the Claypool family, what they were told about Betsy's tie to the flag. Sitting sewing in her shop one day with her girls around her, several gentlemen entered. She recognized one of these as the uncle of her deceased husband, Colonel George Ross, a delegate from Pennsylvania to Congress. She also knew the handsome form and features of the dignified yet graceful and polite commander-in-chief, who, while he was yet Colonel Washington, had visited her shop both professionally and socially many times. They announced themselves as a committee of Congress and stated that they had been appointed to prepare a flag and asked her if she thought she could make one, to which she replied, with her usual modesty and self-reliance, that she did not know, but she could try. She had never made one, but if the pattern were shown to her, she had no doubt of her ability to do it. The committee were shown into her back parlor, the room back of the shop, and Colonel Ross produced a drawing, roughly made, of the proposed flag. It was defective to the clever eye of Mrs. Ross and unsymmetrical, and she offered suggestions which Washington and the committee readily approved. What all these suggestions were, we cannot definitely determine, but they were of sufficient importance to involve an alteration and redrawing of the design, which was then and there done by General George Washington, in pencil in her back parlor. One of the alterations had reference to the shape of the stars. In the drawing they were made with 6 points. Mrs. Ross at once said that this was wrong. The star should be fixed to 5 points. They were aware of that, but thought there would be some difficulty in making a 5-pointed star. Nothing easier, was her prompt reply, and folding a piece of paper in the proper manner, with one clip of her ready scissors, she quickly displayed to their astonished vision the 5-pointed star, which accordingly took its place in the national standard. General Washington was the active one in making the design, the others having little or nothing to do with it. When it was completed, it was given to William Barrett, painter, to paint. He had no part in the design, he only did the painting. The committee suggested Mrs. Ross to call at a certain hour at the counting house of one of their number, a shipping merchant on the wharf. Mrs. Ross was punctual to the appointment. The gentleman drew out of a chest an old ship's color, which he loaned her to show her how the sewing was done, and also the drawing painted by Barrett. Other designs had been prepared by the committee, and 1 or 2 of them were placed in the hands of other seamstresses to be made. Betsy Ross went diligently to work upon her flag, carefully examining the peculiar stitch in the old ship's color, which had been given her a specimen, and recognizing, with the eye of a good mechanic, its important characteristics, strength, and elasticity. The flag was soon finished, and Betsy returned it, the first star-spangled banner that ever floated upon the breeze, to her employer. It was run up to the peak of one of his ships laying at the wharf, and received the unanimous approval of the committee and of a little group of bystanders looking on, and the same day was carried into the State House and laid before Congress with a report from the committee. As much of a skeptic as I am, I will say there's a lot of good circumstantial evidence going in Betsy's favor. One of the reasons is that of one of those three gentlemen part of this mythologized committee is George Ross. George Ross was John Ross's uncle. So Betsy Ross is the niece-in-law of George Ross, a representative for the Continental Congress. We also know for certain that George Washington was indeed a customer of Ross's Upholstery. I talked about earlier that they had made some bed dressings for him. If you need a visual of just how close Betsy was to Washington in her daily routine, check out the proximity of her pew to the generals at Christ Church, which Betsy and John Ross attended in the wake of their marriage. Then there's the fact of Robert Morris, who I don't know too much about having a personal tie to Ross's. He was on the Marine Committee around this time, and the Marine Committee would naturally have an interest in making national colors because warships need flags. If they don't have national colors, they will be considered pirates. Bad things will happen to the crew if you're considered a pirate in the hands of the British. So he wants to have a flag. So all of that is making it seem plausible that Betsy was the one that would have been approached by a flag committee. Then here's where the problems begin. We do have a receipt during the Revolution to Betsy for making flags for the war effort. The problem is it wasn't for national colors, it was for naval ensigns for the Pennsylvania Navy. Yeah, that's right. In addition to the Continental Navy, Pennsylvania had its own state navy. You can hear a little bit more about that in my video on Fort Mifflin. Did Betsy Ross by some chance make the Fort Mifflin garrison flag? So we know she's making flags in 77, not so much in 76. Now, numerous upholsterers were tapped by the Continental Congress, by local militias, by the Continental and the state navies, all sorts of military groups to make various flags throughout the war. That was always a side hustle for upholsterers. So it's not out of the realm that Betsy made a bunch of flags and just none of the documents end up surviving. But this is the big issue for me personally. Spring 76, we have not formally declared independence yet. Making a flag for something that's not assured yet is quite dangerous to do. I mean, if you declare independence, you're automatically a traitor. Yes, we know the Rosses are affiliated with the Patriot cause, but still, this is not a done deal yet. There's also the fact that there are no surviving records of a flag committee being formed by Congress. That there's just not, in none of the meeting minutes is there any mention of something like this. And the actual adoption of the Stars and Stripes as the United States flag won't happen until June 14th, 1777. So you're telling me that Congress had a flag in possession for over a year and then sat on it, even almost a full year after declaring formal independence. Before this presentation in 1870, there was next to no mention of an original flag maker of the United States flag. The closest we got was Francis Hopkinson, who was another member of the Continental Congress, and Hopkinson really liked making designs. That was like his big contribution to the Revolutionary War effort. He was a struggling lawyer in New Jersey before the Revolution, but man, did he have a mouth from the little bit I've gathered. And he was definitely somebody who loved creating pretty pictures to stress his opinion of King George III. And then he went on to make a number of different songs for the Patriot cause. He went on to design numerous currency during the Revolution and later on for the federal government. And yes, he claimed to have created the national flag of the United States of America. He actually at one point requested Congress to compensate him for all these designs, including the national flag, not with money, but with a quarter cask of the public wine. You know what? I feel that's like a fair request. Congress did not respond to that. Eventually, it got appealed a few years later, and Congress had enough of Hopkinson's request and declared that no one individual could have credit for creating these designs. That included the national flag. So there's a little opening there to include Betsy as one of the contributors for the creation of our Stars and Stripes. But that's not where Betsy's story ends. Oh no, she lived many, many years afterwards. I'm just going to kind of hit some of the highlights. First, through the latter half of the Revolution, she would actually marry twice more. First to Joseph Auburn in 1777, and then would marry John Claypole in 1783. Why am I bringing both husbands up now? Well, both of them were employed in the same practice during the Revolution. They were privateers. If you're not familiar with privateering, basically it's piracy endorsed by a government. I know some people in the comments are going to get angry that I described that, but no, literally, it is this merchant ship that's privately owned, that has guns on it, has a letter of marque from a government, in this case, the United States government, and allows them to attack and wreak havoc to all enemy warships, in this case being all vessels assisting the British Empire. Not just active warships, but cargo ships as well, bringing supplies and goods to British soldiers that were occupying the colonies at that point. Letters of marque, such a fascinating age. And the United States government did this because the Continental Navy could never match the British Navy out on the high seas. We just didn't have the infrastructure yet to build such large and such many amounts of warships. So it made more sense just to pay a bunch of merchants to put a few guns in their ships and deal with it themselves. And the reason merchants would do this is, well, they would get to keep a share of the prize money, a share of the goods. They can resell it at other markets. So it was very enticing. Privateering was also very dangerous. And if you want to get an idea what a privateer ship was like, something that Mr. Auburn or Mr. Claypole were stationed upon, I highly recommend you go out to the Independent Seaport Museum in Philadelphia, which we'll be covering a certain artifact of theirs in a future episode of Retracing History. But they have this whole replica of the gun deck of one of these privateering boats. To really give you an idea, they weren't that big. Ideally, a privateering vessel was only manned by about 15 to 30 guys, maybe had about a half a dozen small guns on it, could move very quickly, catch enemy cargo vessels or very small enemy warships off guard, capture them, plunder them, send the prisoners off to the United States, get a cut of the prize money, and just keep going from there. You did not want to get into a battle with a full ship of the line. And unfortunately for Mr. Auburn, who was the second husband of Betsy Ross, that's exactly what happened to him in 1781, I believe off the coast of Ireland, if I'm not mistaken. They went into a 14-hour chase with a frigate. They were ultimately forced to surrender. They were taken prisoners. And since at this point, the British Empire still did not recognize the United States as being independent, these guys were declared traitors and pirates, and they did not have a good time when they were taken into prisoner of war camps. They were ended up sent to the Old Mill Prison in Devon, England. That is where family tradition claims that Auburn would end up meeting Claypole, and Auburn would die in the, I want to say the spring of 1782. Editor Chan will correct me on that. And it's said that Claypole was actually with Auburn in the final days of his life. Claypole and about 230 other prisoners from Philadelphia were eventually released, made the perilous voyage in the summer of 1782 back over to Philadelphia, where Claypole would... Some say that this was the first time he met Betsy. Others say that Claypole may have been a childhood friend of Betsy's. Not fully certain on that. They would end up connecting, and in 1783, they would marry. And it's really from the Claypole, from John Claypole, where most of Betsy's descendants come from. Now, not long after John Claypole had married Elizabeth Griscom, what would end up happening is they would actually convert to the Society of Free Quakers. Now, that's not to be confused with the Society of Friends, the original Quakers in Philadelphia and throughout North America. The Society of Free Quakers was formed by a bunch of Quakers who had been, for one reason or another, excommunicated from the meeting house. A lot of them excommunicated for taking up arms or giving material support to the Patriot War effort during the Revolutionary War. So they made their own meeting house. Betsy wanted to return to her family roots as being a part of the Society of Friends, but now with the Free Quakers, so her and John would join by the mid-1780s. As John and Betsy began to have a large family, Betsy would maintain the upholstery business. John actually would become involved with it. Now, he wasn't an upholsterer by trade. Mr. Claypool was actually a tanner by trade, but after many years of privateering, you can only imagine where he's like, can I go back on the ocean? And Betsy's probably like, I lost one husband to the high seas. I ain't losing another. So John, for a number of years, actually learned the trade of upholstery from Betsy. However, John eventually went off and sought a federal office because by 1790, Philadelphia was the official capital of the United States. Okay, it already had been, but what had changed was we were no longer under the Articles of Confederation. We were under the U.S. Constitution. We had a new federal government set up. And until we got a permanent capital built in what is now Washington, D.C., for the first decade, it was in Philadelphia. And many Philadelphians were eager to try to get a job from the federal government. John was successful in doing this. In 1794, he became a customs inspector for the port of Philadelphia. And unfortunately for John, after this appointment, he started to suffer from old war wounds. By the early 1800s, he really could not maintain a job. And the Claypools would have to regularly rely upon charity from the Society of Free Quakers, that and the business that Betsy kept getting in her upholstery shop. And well, she was about to get some very intriguing requests in the early 1800s. It's between the period of 1803 and 1812 where the most records survive of Betsy Claypool being employed in the actual trade of making flags. This is in part because of who's in charge of the Purveyor of Public Supplies Department in that time period. That was Tench Cox. Why is he important? Well, back in the 1780s, Tench Cox served briefly in the same abolition society as John Claypool did. And we do know that Cox was a customer of Claypool's upholstery. So he's familiar with who Betsy is. Makes sense that he's going to be the one pushing the contract to make all these various American flags. And what are all these American flags for? Various things for a rapidly expanded United States. 1803 is the same year of the Louisiana Purchase, where we quite literally doubled the territorial size of the country, which means you're going to have all these expeditions going out west, interacting with indigenous tribes. And one of the key trade goods was American flags, kind of being as a sign of peace, diplomacy. We want you to be with the United States of America. We can talk all about the shadiness of what was going on later on. That's not what this episode's about. So you needed all of these American flags for these expeditionary forces and for all the new ports and cities you're going to establish. She is going to make flags for the city of New Orleans. She's making flags for the Indian Department. She's also going to be making flags for storage at the Schuylkill Arsenal, not far from where she's living in Philadelphia, where it'll be mass stockpiled. Then we know that she is being contracted to create silk regimental flags for the various infantry and artillery batteries. And why are we making flags for a bunch of military units? Well, it's because the country's on edge, especially after the Chesapeake affair of 1807. Long story short, a British warship forced the USS Chesapeake to stop. British forces boarded and started trying to impress sailors into the Royal Navy, claiming that they were English sailors that had escaped. This is one of the inciting incidents that would eventually lead to the War of 1812. So the United States is on edge. We're expecting that we're about to go to war with Great Britain once more, so we got to get all of our material goods ready for such a conflict. So Betsy was in the thick of that build up to the War of 1812. This is where most of our documentation exists of Betsy Claypool being an actual flag maker, making national colors. Following the death of John Claypool in 1817, Betsy and several of her daughters tried to maintain the upholstery business as best as possible, but facing the Industrial Revolution and failing eyesight, Betsy was ultimately forced to retire at the age of 75. She would still be a regular member of the Society of Free Quakers, trying to attend every meeting. Ultimately, though, herself and another member in late 1835 decided, with no new members coming in, just the two of them going to the meetings, it was ultimately decided to dissolve the Society of Free Quakers. And not too long after that, on January 31st, 1836, Elizabeth Claypool would pass away. However, Betsy Ross has not rested in peace. A phrase I've said one too many times on this channel. I'm looking at you, A.P. Hill. Originally, she was interred at the burial grounds of the Free Quakers on Philadelphia's 5th Street, But in 1856, she had to be relocated alongside the remains of John, for the city had acquired the property of the now closed meeting house. They were interred at the recently opened Mount Moyer Cemetery. Fast forward to 1975, and bicentennial fever is running wild across Philadelphia. There was a motion by key figures in the city to relocate the Claypools to the Arch Street residence associated with the Betsy Ross myth. It wasn't just to be a publicity stunt, however, as the region around Mount Moyer had become rather run down. In fact, Betsy's headstone had been stolen at one point. The problem was, when they went to exhume the remains marked as Betsy's grave, there were no remains found. Eventually, the remains of a man and a woman were discovered within the family plot and were reinterred in the courtyard of the Betsy Ross House Museum. Today, you too can pay your respects to someone under a headstone etched with Betsy's name next to a house which is accepted in popular memory as her residence, where she may have created the prototype of the American flag. Oh, poor Betsy. At least she will have company in the Not Resting Peacefully Club here on Readout Productions. That's going to conclude this edition of Retracing History, and I'll be honest, it's a very small house to explore, only a handful of rooms, but you'll learn quite a bit about Betsy Ross and realize she had far more of an impact on the American Revolution than just simply sewing the flag together. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like button down below. If you want to follow us on future adventures, be sure to subscribe here to the channel. And if you want to go the extra mile supporting us, keeping us on the road and keeping us caffeinated, like, you know, we could go, there's a Starbucks right across Betsy Ross's to keep us caffeinated, if we need it. We have our membership program, The Garrison. It's a small monthly membership. Links in the description below if you want to join this bastion of historical preservation. Hey, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.